Hello, and welcome to today's webinar, Bridging the Gap, Making Federated Identities Work for Academic Libraries and Their Service Providers. This is our monthly webinar focused on all things identity and access management, brought to you by InCommon and Internet2. I'm Jody Tracy, Program Manager for Cohorts and Accelerators at the InCommon Academy, and I'll be your host for today. Next slide, please. Just a few reminders about today's program. As always, we'll be taking questions and comments live using the Zoom Q&A function. So please go ahead, send us your questions throughout the presentation. We also encourage you to post your messages in the chat. Your comments are here for group discussion. Just be sure when you're posting that the message is set to be sent to everyone in that drop-down. And just a reminder that this event is being recorded. So if you registered for this IAM online webinar, you'll receive an email with a link to the recording as well as the slides. And then we'll also post these on the InCommon website and to the YouTube channel. So you can watch for those links coming out. And now we're excited to begin today's webinar, Bridging the Gap, Making Federated Identity Work for Academic Libraries and Their Service Providers, and hear from Zanil Green, Albert Wu, and Amanda Ferrante, who will explore how libraries can leverage the security enhancements of institutional identity providers while maintaining libraries' privacy protecting expectations. So to kick things off today, I am pleased to turn things over to our moderator for today, Industry Relationship Manager at Internet2, James Crampton. James, take it away.
Thank you, Jody. Welcome, everyone. I appreciate you coming to learn more about the interplay between what's often managed in central IT of the Federation of an institution and academic libraries. We know there are some social aspects to this and a lot of technological misunderstandings. So we're hopeful that we can clear these up for you today. I'm James Crampton. I'm Industry Relationship Manager at Internet2, and I will be managing the Q&A section and the chats. We'll likely have a round at the end where we're going to talk about those. So for now, let me introduce our speakers. We're going to start out with Amanda Ferrante. She's Principal Product Manager for IAM at EBSCO. And she'll be followed by Zanil Green, who's e-access librarian at Duke University. And finally, we'll hear from the Federation operator perspective from Albert Wu here at Internet2. So with that, I'll turn it over to Amanda.
All right. Thanks, James. Before we get into our session today, I wanted to start on this slide as a really quick foundation for what we'll cover. I personally love this slide because it's actually a slide that Albert made. Albert presented this to kick off our session, a very similar webinar that we presented recently to NISO. And if any of you are not familiar, NISO is a very academic library heavy and library service provider heavy community. And so this is just a really nice reminder that even the best technology depends on shared understanding, institutional buy-in, and supportive policy to succeed. Academic libraries often enter this ecosystem with a really distinct set of priorities, which can include privacy, minimal friction for their users, and support for a diverse, sometimes transient set of user groups. And as I read those off to you, if you work in IAM, you might be thinking, well, those are my priorities too. And that's why I'm really glad that Zanil is here with us today to share the more nuanced experiences of academic librarians. So this is setting the stage because while we all agree that Federation provides shared trust, policy, and infrastructure, this is really just a starting point to explore why the library sector hasn't yet been fully able to benefit from it. So I'll start off on more service provider experiential content with this slide. And really, actually, I have a quick anecdote to start with. When I attended TechX last year for the very first time for me, almost every new person I met at TechX would glance at my badge and they'd say, EBSCO, what's that? And to be honest, it was kind of shocking to me because EBSCO is absolutely ubiquitous in libraries worldwide, full stop. And it's not actually that uncommon to hear somebody say, oh yeah, I used to do my research with EBSCO host, rather than actually referencing the broader set of library resources. So to me, this experience at TechX was a really interesting example of something important about our shared problem space. Libraries rely heavily on services like EBSCO and many service providers and publishers like us. And those services typically require authentication, but these services aren't typically visible in the IAM community. So that is sort of the preamble that brings me to the numbers on this slide. Today, EBSCO serves around 7,200 academic libraries worldwide, whose institutions are already members of an identity federation. So that includes InCommon in the US, but also many other federations that EBSCO participates in worldwide. But what we see is that adoption of federated identity amongst academic libraries varies dramatically by federation. And in the US in particular, only about 10% of the institutions who participate in InCommon have libraries that are using federated identity to access EBSCO's platform. So this is just an EBSCO snapshot, not a community-wide assessment. But really what this means is that they likely aren't using their federation to access the majority of other library resources and publisher content as well. So what this tells us is that many academic libraries are technically capable, but the majority still opt out of using federation. And it was really this particular data point that prompted me to start reaching out to librarians like Zanil, and also to intentionally work at strengthening our relationship with the federation community. So when I saw this, when we did this analysis, I wanted to better understand why this adoption gap exists. And specifically, what are the barriers for folks with boots on the ground in the library to adopting federation? How can we collaborate most effectively across libraries, providers, and the federation community to close those gaps? So some of you may be asking yourselves, well, if they're not using the federation, then what do academic libraries typically use for access to research? And again, this is another EBSCO specific snapshot, but I believe it's characteristic of many other service providers and publishers in this corner of research and education. Typically, we see academic libraries relying on methods that have been really standard in this space for decades. IP recognition, proxy IP masking tools, credentials that are shared between many patrons, referring URL rules, pattern barcodes, and so on. And few of these methods actually involve user-based authentication. They're really closer to simple rules that let providers like EBSCO assume that the user is affiliated with the subscribing institution. And today, these methods are very widely used, but unfortunately, some of them aren't as dependable as they were 10 years ago, 20 years ago, or even 30 when some of them were coming on the scene. And we're starting to observe that in rates of failure, access attempts to research and education materials that are not succeeding. So my perspective, why I am involved in this conversation, is that my role is to ensure successful, authorized access to critical research materials. And when we see increasing failure in the status quo, then that should motivate us to look at how we can increase the practicality, the appeal of methods that do scale well today, like single sign-on, like identity federation. So I've had a lot of really good federations with conversations in the last year with this group that have aimed to define anything that represents an obstacle in this area. So this slide is meant to capture how we kind of arrived at this current landscape in academic libraries and for library-oriented service providers. On the last slide, I mentioned a bunch of access methods that may have been horrifying to some of you if you work in IAM or security, but really in the library space, IP-based access has been king for decades. And this is because it's historically worked very well. It's been good enough for a very long time. It's easy to manage across many service providers. And in the academic library space, some libraries are managing access to hundreds and hundreds of service providers. So ease of administration is absolutely a factor. It's also perceived as aligning very well with longstanding values, notably that it supports anonymity in a way that's consistent with expectations around privacy and confidentiality of research. What's really changed in the last few years is its stability. In particular, at EBSCO, we've seen roughly a 33% decline in successful IP-based access in the last 3 years. And we believe much of that decline comes from what you'd probably think of as table stakes cybersecurity practices on campus, things that simply make the user's visible IP address less predictable or less visible from the outside. But even though IP is becoming less reliable, many libraries still don't see federated identity as their next logical step. There are gaps, perceived gaps or real gaps between what Federation offers and what libraries need or want, whether those gaps are technical, workflow related, or even philosophical. And my opinion is that library use cases are not always represented at the tables where Federation policy is being innovated or evolved. And so as long as that is the case, that perceived disconnect will persist. Limited librarian participation at those tables can unintentionally reinforce that sense that Federation isn't designed with their specific context in mind. And finally, I would like to share that this is not a small problem in scope. I don't actually have great numbers for this, but I know just from talking with peers in this corner of the industry that this affects hundreds of library-centric service providers and publishers worldwide. Across the industry, reliance on low assurance methods remains extremely high. And some platforms report upwards of 90% of all of their successful access coming from on-campus IP ranges. And if that is the case, knowing that there is a declining stability for those access methods, we should be assuming that there's a lot of failed access to that critical research and information that people are using today. So we know that federated identity is built on standardization, shared policies, common expectations that work extremely well across research and higher ed environments. But when we bring that model into the library space, there can be a natural tension. And this gets at some of the disconnect, I think, in mission that leads to perhaps people not communicating as well across different stakeholders. Libraries prioritize things like openness, ease of access, privacy, confidentiality, anonymity. Federation by design focuses on assurance and authorization. And of course, there can be a natural tension between those priorities. So while neither set of priorities is wrong, they just come from different starting points. And this perceived disconnect is sometimes also exacerbated when libraries aren't aware of the work being done, oftentimes within their own institutions, to standardize things like minimal data release, user group-based authorization, and so on. So really what all of this leads to is a persistent cycle. This is the pattern that we see in the ecosystem. When libraries find federated identity difficult to implement or difficult to align with their workflows, they will typically continue relying on legacy access methods. Service providers then see low demand for federation-related features, so they will focus their development on maintaining or reinforcing the low assurance methods that libraries are relying upon. And without strong, consistent implementation across service providers, libraries don't see improvements that would make federation more appealing to them. So that cycle continues. And this has implications, I believe, for all of us as stakeholders at the table. For libraries, it means relying on methods that have been effective and reliable for decades, but are increasingly unstable over time. For service providers like EBSCO, it means continuing to support a hodgepodge of low assurance methods because they remain the dominant form of access in our market. And even when a provider wants to improve support for federation features, the business case can actually be quite difficult to make if most of our customers are not using it. So that means that features like deep linking, which improves user experience, features like access entity categories, which would standardize minimal data release and shore up privacy protection. Development to meet those guidelines doesn't move as quickly as it could in our corner of the industry. And that is very naturally of concern to the Federation. who aren't seeing adoption of very valuable intentional standards and policy in a segment of the market. If service providers don't see market pressure to align with guidance, then adoption naturally lags. And for those of you attending as university IT, security, or IAM folks, an honorable mention for you too. It means that a significant part of the university's research mission is still underpinned by low assurance access methods. And that is not a criticism. It is simply the byproduct of these historical patterns. But it can create some complexity when an institution is trying to modernize its identity practices, strengthen security posture, plan for more user-centric access models, and so on. So this is the environment that we are all working in, and it is absolutely a key reason why we wanted to bring both the library and Federation perspectives into this session, as well as the service providers. So from my perspective, breaking the cycle isn't about a single fix. It's about better coordination across the ecosystem. We've seen that incremental adoption does build momentum. Clearer signals from libraries and institutions can make it much easier for service providers to invest in Federation. And federations, I believe, benefit from closer alignment with library workflows and library-centric service providers. So in my view, progress in any one of these areas could support benefits to all of us. And with that, I believe we have a quick poll for the audience just to take a quick beat. And this should pop up in your Zoom window. We'd love to hear if you do work in the university IT, security, IAM space, how you would describe your current relationship with your institution's academic library. So go ahead and respond to that if you feel comfortable.
So it looks like there's a clear leader here in transactional.
Something that I mentioned when presenting a similar session recently is that much of the success that I have observed with the librarians that I've worked with, folks like Zanil, occurs when the library and the university stakeholders better understand one another's mission. And sometimes without that, we do see more of that transactional or disconnected relationship nature. So not totally surprising to see that breakdown. We're happy to talk more about that at the end. But for now, I will transition over to Zanil. Take it away.
Hi, everyone. I will be picking up with the librarian's point of view. So from our perspective, implementing federated authentication often introduces some friction to our access model. Federations like In Common are typically designed to simplify access between universities and service providers, but in practice, many librarians still opt out due to various reasons, which I'll explore further in this webinar. A lot of the hesitation comes from a lack of autonomy, especially when access, particularly federated authentication decisions, are managed centrally by IT or vendor systems. And so we tend to be disconnected from knowing how federated authentication actually works. So I wanted to start by asking a couple of questions. How widely is federated authentication being adopted across academic libraries? And for those using it, what makes their workflow successful? And these questions shaped my exploration of the barriers and the big breakthroughs in implementation. Next slide, please. So across academic institutions, the picture tends to be quite mixed. Many librarians are still learning about In Common. There's awareness of SSO, but less clarity about how it fits into library workflows and how much control is retained once it's implemented. It's not that librarians are resistant to change. Instead, we're committed to understanding how the impact of federated authentication affects our users, our data, and licensing management. So one of the examples I wanted to point out was the data. So according to Marshall Breeding's 2022 Special Report on Authentication, This was a survey given to librarians. Out of 1,200 responses, only 34 responded saying they used a shibboleth-based federated solution. So IP authentication still dominates because it's familiar, it's predictable, and it requires less coordination across multiple departments. I still wanted to highlight that change is underway. A lot of librarians are trying to close the knowledge gap through workshops, reviewing technical documentation, and building IT partnerships. So there's incremental progress in building a foundation of usually in-house expertise, which will hopefully support broader adoption in the future. So we'll move on to the pain points. So the whys and the why nots of implementation of federated authentication. So I highlighted 3 themes to explain the challenges: institutional fit, capacity, and ease of implementation. So for institutional fit, every library tends to operate in a distinct context, different sizes, patron groups, and governance models. So authentication ecosystems vary. Next, we have capacity. Federated authentication isn't a plug-and-play solution. It demands funding, staff time, some technical knowledge, and cross-departmental collaboration. And so with lean budgets and smaller teams, adding another access system feels daunting to some librarians. About implementation ease, even when institutions are ready, the process can appear quite opaque. Terminology in the federated authentication scape, like refeds and entity categories, don't always translate clearly to staff who are focused on what data is shared in this process and why. So I'll go in on each individually, starting with institutional fit. Next slide, please. So it is usually what determines the success of a federated authentication rollout. Every library has its own culture and technology environment. A research university has very different authentication needs from a community college or, for example, public library. Not every library will benefit equally from an SSO-based authentication setup, and that is okay. So we have access nuances. Most libraries still rely heavily on IP authentication because, again, as Amanda mentioned, it is king, it is well understood, and it coexists with proxying technologies. Since not every institution participates in common or has infrastructure for federation, it is the simplest solution. When it comes to our patron groups, that's another major consideration. Universities serve many audiences, undergrads, graduate students, faculty, staff, visiting scholars, alumni, and in some cases, affiliated institutions. And I think I saw in our Q&A, somebody mentioned walk-in users. Each group's access rights are tied to licensing terms that can differ from resource to resource. So, for example, a medical database can be restricted to one school, while a general reference package is open to like the entire university. So managing those distinctions within a federated system needs like, precise provisioning and clear communication between library, IT, and vendors about which attributes define eligibility. If licensing changes occur, the authentication configuration must shift as well. So there's a little bit of administrative work there. And of course, the user experience matters as well. So the more accurately we set up these groups, the smoother the access process will be for them. Finally, we have library autonomy. Some academic libraries have limited control over access management. So identity management, as mentioned before, may sit centrally with IT. And because it's there, vendors may enable SSO without consulting the library. And this can leave librarians in the dark about what patron data is exchanged and how usage is tracked. Ironically, both IT departments, university, and vendors are usually unaware of contract agreements that complicate patron access. So usage data drives evidence-based decisions. So we need to know which groups are or aren't accessing specific resources, because when authentication changes, without our input, they disrupt our insight into usage patterns and our ability to demonstrate value or spot any access gaps. So our institutional fit is usually about aligning whatever Federation authentication brings to the table with the local authentication ecosystem and library oversight. We can now move on to capacity. The second factor shaping success, capacity, whether we have the people, time, or knowledge to make federated authentication work. Many libraries lack the dedicated identity management staff. Smaller teams juggle daily responsibilities, and they would have like the extra workload of learning a new authentication system. The learning curve can be steep. Federated authentication involves some specialized terminology, attribute release, entity categories, group management. Understanding what data is exchanged and how to negotiate that with vendors requires a little bit of technical fluency. For example, at Duke, I learned that like my IAM team uses like Grouper, and we put our user groups in policy groups, which helped me to better communicate with my own team, my own colleagues, and external IT. But this expertise took time and collaboration to build. For training and education, across the profession, librarians need support to build knowledge, and we usually, when we get that knowledge, share it through workshops and webinars and documentation, but it's definitely something that is needed to like build up our know-how of how the system works. Finally, implementing federated authentication introduces new workflow. We have to communicate with other library staff, IT, vendors. Each implementation requires coordination to confirm user groups, attribute requirements, and testing before we launch. So it is a lot of work, a lot of partnership building to fix the issue of overcoming capacity gaps. And finally, I'll touch on implementation ease. And next slide, please. So this final factor is implementation ease, or the lack of it. So even when institutions are equipped for federation, librarians often find the process complex. The technical frameworks behind SSO can be difficult to decode without an IT background. And usually librarians see attribute bundles, the anonymous, pseudonymous, personalized bundles, refeds, entity categories, and wonder in plain terms what exact user data is being shared, who is seeing it, is this data being retained? And these details are important to us because like we champion patroncy, privacy, and want to retain patron trust. Licensing adds another important layer. Each library resource, as mentioned before, might differ on who gets access depending on program or patron status. And these distinctions not only need coordination with IT and vendors, vendor support varies widely. So large platforms support SSO, smaller niche providers may rely solely on IP access. So there is a hybrid environment that even if we move in the future more into federated authentication, it will in the near future continue to be a hybrid environment that requires us to manage multiple authentication methods. And finally, data privacy. We always champion patron privacy, so we're cautious about adopting any system that could expose personally identifiable information or patrons' usage patterns. Before enabling SSO, we tend to want transparency into the released attributes and how they align with our licensing requirements. And it's a huge thing for us that we want to be able to know and make it easier for us to adopt without sacrificing privacy or autonomy. And my final slide will be a case study into Duke University libraries. So this is a practical example coming from my institution. So we started off my department by identifying stakeholders since Duke IAM manages authentication. We started by building relationships, which helped both sides understand priorities. We wanted transparency into data release for licensing, and I wanted to ensure compliance and security. On the technical front, Duke IAM shared an existing resource. They have the Duke Authentication Manager platform, and it gave me and my team insights into the tools like Grouper and Group Manager to support implementation and access control for us. So this platform also supports complex implementation for vendors who aren't a part of InCommon. And another thing we focused on was documentation. I began documenting attribute bundle types and drafting language supporting patron anonymity for future licensing contracts. So the documentation is an evolving foundation for our authentication policy that we're slowly building bit by bit. Success was also dependent on professional development and knowledge sharing. I took the opportunity to participate in things like InCommon Basecamp, which is supported by my university library. Was able to join library authentication committees, and I was able to present and share things widely with library colleagues and peers. So there's been steady progress in recent years. DUL has expanded SSO support from just a handful of library e-resources to dozens. And the central lesson that I've taken away from this, the success that we've had has been organizational alignment. So we've built trust, documented a lot of what led to our success, and it's turned into a lasting collaboration between my e-resources department and Duke Identity and Access Management. So my final takeaway before I hand it over to Albert is to say shared frameworks help reduce exposure to phishing, limited automated bot traffic, and ensure that only authorized users access licensed content. So not only does working between libraries and IT streamline authentication access, it also strengthens security. So your story doesn't have to look exactly like Duke's. You can start with a shared documentation space, a small joint working group, or scheduling reoccurring check-ins between librarians and IAM, and these small connections will build trust and move us toward a more robust authentication ecosystem. And I think our next slide is another poll about supporting your campus library and federated access.
So it looks like 42% said clear documentation about library use cases would be helpful. 29% said example attribute release policies for content providers. 23% contacts or working groups connecting IT and library. And then a handful of folks who are not sure and would like to learn more. So stay tuned.
I'll hand it off to Albert.
All right, thank you. Okay, can everybody hear me?
Yep, we got you.
Okay, good. Well, thank you everybody. And I'm glad that set of questions just popped up because it's a great segue. My name is Albert Wu. I'm the Incommon Federation's Federation Manager, and I'll share my perspective as a Federation operator, how all of this tie together, and also share with you all some of the things we have been doing for some number of years that you may or may not be aware is connected to this. Um, and I also share my personal observations of where our gaps still remain and the work to be done. Um, and when I say we, I mean us as a Federation community as a whole. Let's continue. Next slide, please. So first, some of the things that In Common Federation has been doing for the last several years that you may or may not have connected the dots with. In the poll that just came up, one of your feedback is you would like to see more documentation and as well as guidance on content provider attribute release policies. Um, Interestingly enough, one of the things that In Common Technical Advisory Committee did in 2024 was a body of work to develop deployment guidance on how to use a set of privacy preserving and privacy aware attribute release bundles. Collectively, they're called REFEDS access entity categories. And there are three categories, each fitting a particular level or degree of privacy preservation in library and journal use cases. I will post a link to that report. The reason you may not have heard much about it, other than a brief email, is in that report, it called for a refresh of identifiers, user identifiers. And that is the second thing TAC did mostly in 2025. And in fact, the report was just released, and this further clarified how we think the in-common community should adopt and use the set of identifiers needed for these categories. So together, they form the foundation of what I think of as a foundational set of standard attribute release practice for content providers. It doesn't necessarily address every possible use case scenarios, but I think this is a really major milestone. So if you have not heard of or seen these reports and you happen to be interested in diving into details, I encourage you to read these materials. Um, in addition to that, we also recently rolled out, actually at the beginning of the year, we rolled out support for seamless access, which is a new home institution discovery experience. This was actually continues to be a joint effort between the publishing community, library community, and Federation operators. It's the new, essentially, in-common discovery service. Um, if you want to learn more about that, I'm happy to chat with you after the call or during Q&A. Finally, and this is a thing that's just starting to pick up momentum, to make sure we have broad adoption and systematic adoption, the In Common Community and Trust and Assurance Commit Board is also now working on the next chapter in raising trust and interoperability in common federations. Right now, the proposed program is called Federation Expectations, and a working group is working on developing that program. It is still a very active working group. So much of the work is still being developed, and we hope you'll hear a lot more next month at TechX. So if you are planning on attending TechX, I very much encourage you to look forward to the sessions. All three topics are going to be presented at TechX, and I think Amanda will also be talking about this topic we're talking about today more from a security aspect as well. So I highly encourage you to look for those. And if you are going to be there early, Monday is a morning workshop called Federation Day, where we're going to focus on a lot of these topics and how they tie together. So it's an opportunity for you to join us and have an in-person discussion. Let's go to the next slide. All of those work aside, we still have a lot to do. I mentioned earlier, attribute release has been, if you have been in the Federation community for a while, you know attribute release has been a challenge, and that remains to be a challenge. We think Federation expectations and along with the access entity categories will start to build a foundation for more consistent release. But ultimately, this requires adoption. And that's the next big conversation I think our community needs to have. How do we support each other to make sure there's more widespread and consistent adoption? Um, the second, and this is specifically with this session topic, um, both in my personal observation and in talking with um, various teams at universities, we hear a consistent theme of the libraries and the IAM teams may not be on the same page at all times. We kind of saw a little bit of that in the poll earlier. Today's relationship seems to lean on a transactional side rather than a partnership side. Um, I think we can do better. I think we need to work much more towards becoming partners in on campus. To Zanil's point as well, it is very important, I think, that the IM teams on campus understand and embrace the library's use cases for user access if we want this to succeed. Right? Um, the next observation I am seeing is increasingly we're seeing signs that, um, especially from the service provider side, there's an assumption that Federation somehow is the enforcement body. That's not how In-Common Federation began. And I'm not saying this perspective is not correct, but it does raise the question of do we have a disconnect between our community's expectation of the Federation community versus what we are doing? And that's a conversation we need to have, right? What do we want out of the Federation? Um, then on the workflow side, this is more, I don't want to say tactical, more maybe more sort of on the ground, tangible. The login experience is confusing. Let's face it, right? Our own individual login page may be perfect, but when you combine that with finding the home institution, then getting to the resource and then getting rejected and then not being able to find help, that experience is not great. We need to do better. Um, there is actually a group that may be tackling that. James is heading up with a group called RP Onboarding Working Group that may be touching on that. So if you'd like to learn more about that, again, either contact either one of us or reach out to us at TechX. And finally, and the bullet library often bears a disproportionate support burden. I'm going to generalize that to service providers, resource providers often bear a lot more of the access um, support burdens than you would think. Um, if you'd like to, me to elaborate on that, happy to in the Q&A, but I'm going to move on to the next slide. So in the end, in summary, how can we help? How can we as a federation help to bridge these gaps? The first is policy alignments, and that's one of the things, the themes we're here to rally support for. We really would like our community as a whole to embrace these standards that we've been advertising more consistently. And Federation expectations as a program may be a more explicit statements about how that would happen. Um, we do think both IDPs and SPs in our community need more practical tools and documentation to help with this work. And the poll we just put up very much validates that point as well. Where we need help is more clear direction on what kind of tools and what kind of documentation you're looking for, because we could be boiling the ocean here, and that's not helpful. So we want to be able to better prioritize. Community expectations, I've been saying Federation expectations for a bit now, and that's a bit of a teaser. So look for that coming up. And finally, the neutral convening, and that was a point also in Zanil's poll as well, right? We are looking to bridge this divide. Um, you could say break down the silo, if you will. We think the success here depends a lot on us talking together and building common solutions rather than going off on our own and do things, right? And if you have ideas, suggestions, or pointers on where we can start, please, by all means, we're very much open to suggestions. Next slide, please. Looking ahead, we are continuing to tackle this login, the discovery topic, and this is not just in common. I think Federation community as a whole is continuing to trying to tackle this problem. It's a tough one. If you have skills, expertise, experience, and suggestions, this is where we could really use work and contribution. So I'm putting out a call for help, if you will. Privacy statements. I think this one we're doing well, though I think this is something we want to always keep on top of mind, right? Privacy preserving access is not always a top of mind thing for campus access, but when it comes to library research, this is pretty important. In fact, very important, right? Community maturity, again, Federation expectations, look for that. And finally, I'll just leave you to read that goal. And that's, I think, it for me. Oh, there's more.
Yeah, I'll bring you one more slide.
I have one more slides. Okay. So this is actually this is in case you guys don't know, we're also doing this not just in an in-common community, we're also doing this in the library and journal publisher community as well. So we did a similar presentation with a different focus in September at the NISO virtual conference. So our goal here is to start building that bridge, connecting the communities together, and perhaps joint efforts in co-create and co-curate the standards we all use, embrace, right? The attribute release bundles, for example, a lot of the single sign-on concerns are cross vertical concerns. It's not an IAM only thing, and it's not a library only thing, right? We need to work together on this. Um, to the degree we can I'll use the term co-brand and co-endorse these standards, it strengthens the power and the validity of these standards, right? So, and I think that's it for me. Right.
Yes, thank you. We do have a number of Q&A and chat topics that have just come in. So I'd like to go through those, and really any of the panelists that wants to comment on these, jump right in. Our first comes from SR, who asks, with increasing adoption of federated SSO amongst publishers, how do we maintain things like walk-in patron access when identity providers are not well equipped to handle this case?
I imagine all of us might have some form of an answer to that one. I'm happy to start, but I can't necessarily represent the broad range of perspectives and experience that we have here. I can speak from EBSCO's perspective. When a library needs to support access for different user groups, some of whom are not supported by the identity provider, the majority of the time we do see that the library continues to fall back on those less reliable or low assurance methods for their walk-in users. Or for their diverse user groups. Walk-in users, I think, is one really common example of this, where many academic institutions have a mandate to support users from their community who may not actually be students, faculty, or staff, and therefore don't have an identity in your identity provider. As a result, those users typically can be pretty easily supported from on campus using that IP-based access. But it does get kind of complicated if we're now talking about, say, access for alumni or for diverse user groups who are not students, faculty, or staff, and who also are remote. In that scenario, it tends to be more of a challenge for the service provider and the library to collectively brainstorm how to retain access. And at the end of the day, this also results in a really poor user experience where many researchers, regardless of what group they belong to, are tending to start their research on the open web these days, not at the library website. So where maybe a decade ago, the library could support IP-based access versus, say, single sign-on for their different user groups and curate those URLs to specifically prompt for those methods. When somebody's going straight to Google or straight to ChatGPT and just finding a more general URL that's not curated by the library, we see a lot more of a challenge of users getting access when they can't all be supported by a singular authentication tool.
Albert, Neil, do you have thoughts on that?
Amanda already had like a good point from the point of view of a service provider. Um, when it comes to libraries, that's definitely a user group we always support. I've spoken to different librarians. Everyone either retains IP access, like on-site access specifically for user groups, or they have a set of, for example, hardwired computers for walk-in users. So it will always be a continuous pain point that at this point in time, I don't know if like any IAM person can respond if their institution has done anything different. There's not a federated authentication solution for walk-in users.
I will chime in on this, and this is not let me preface what I'm about to say with this is not an in common federation position. This is a personal observation as a past IAM, IDP, SSO operator, right? And my observation is this. If walk-in patrons is a legitimate use case on your campus as a user, anonymous user, basically, does your IAM solution support that anonymous use case? If not, do you fully support library anonymous privacy preserving access? That's not necessarily an easy question to answer because this is where we get into a tough interaction between the need for privacy preserving access versus the need for security, right? And with security becoming increasingly a challenge, this gets tougher. But I think it's a conversation worth having, and it's a thought worth something worth analyzing as you design and plan your IAM solutions, right? What does your IAM solution support? What use cases on your campus, right?
Thank you, you three. We've had a couple of questions surrounding the evolving nature of the IP market, right? You know, first of all, there's an IPv4 resale market and IPv6 adoption at different rates across the globe. And also remote work, right? These are all aspects that touch on IP authentication. Do you have any thoughts on like what are the greatest pressures on the IP market right now from an authentication perspective?
My opinion, again, and I'd be interested to hear Zaniel's point of view as well, because I'm sure this looked very different for librarians, especially at the start of the COVID-19 pandemic. Users beginning to work remotely en masse was a challenge, absolutely. But in my opinion, that was just a small taste of what we're experiencing today. Today, remote access is a challenge in that many libraries do have some sort of authentication that can be prompted if somebody's not on site. That is a challenge, again, because users are starting from the open web. They're not always finding the links that are using a proxy IP tool, which needs a syntax at the beginning of a URL. Or there's a different prompted fallback method being used for many of the different service providers of library licenses resources from. So it creates a very inconsistent, unpredictable, and hard to navigate user experience from what I have heard from the libraries I work with. However, I think actually, I suspect what's causing failures more these days in IP-based access are what I called earlier in the presentation, more table stakes cybersecurity measures in institutions, VPNs, transient IP ranges, things that cause somebody's IP address to be unpredictable from a day-to-day, may be very good for security posture, but is very bad for the types of access methodologies that libraries do still heavily rely upon. And so bringing it to the question about IPv4 versus IPv6, the increasing failure of IP-based access at times due to very good positive security practices, I think is giving many service providers pause when it comes to implementing support for IPv6. We have tons of demand for implementing support for IPv6, but it is, again, hard to create a business case for large-scale development when moving to IPv6 doesn't necessarily mean that you'll see fewer failures because of these other sort of factors outside of many of our control. So I'll leave it at that. Many challenges to be had.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more live question here before we need to wrap it up. I know Albert and Amanda are typing answers to two others. But Will Cooley asks, is there a place more appropriate than the Shibboleth Slack channel and the mailing list to discuss strategies for moving to entity category-based release from an overly permissive release practice? This is less of a technical question than a business process question. Albert, I put you on the spot for that one.
I'm sorry, which question was that?
This one's from Will Cooley about, is there an appropriate place to ask questions for entity category-based release?
That's a good one. I'm going to ask counter questions. Is mailing list better or is the Slack better? As a targeted group, I'm happy to set up a Slack channel, though that tend not to scale very well for a very large conversation. As if we want this conversation to be very broad and large scale, a mailing list tends to be better. In common participants is the default as a mailing list. But if you would like to have a more in-depth focused discussion around this, I'm happy to also set up a Slack channel or a mailing list for that.
Great, thank you, Albert. And Jody, I think we're at the end of our time, so I'll return the mic to you.
All right. Well, thank you so much for all of your participation today. Really great conversations in chat, really great questions in the Q&A. Clearly, we need to continue the conversation, so stay tuned.